Oh, okay.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Andrew Foster, who's from the Brown University in the US. He's a professor and chair in the Department of Economics and a professor of community health. He's a microeconomist, an empirical microeconomist, with interest in the areas of population, environment, development, and health. And he has recently examined economic growth in rural India, exploring issues such as growth of the non-farm economy, the effects of local democratization, groundwater usage, forest cover, household structure, inequality, and schooling, which means he's very close to all that we do at IRMA. He has authored a number of scholarly articles and written in leading international journals, contributed to various books, research papers, seminars, conferences, etc. And he's currently the associate editor of Journal of Economic Growth and Journal of Human Resources. He has been a referee of the American Economic Review, Econometrica, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Journal of Political Economy, and many others over the last years. Now, this is too scary for an economist. These are journals that one aspires to publish in and never quite get there. So, so that was a scary list. And he's here today among us to talk about the conditions of democratization of villages and how it helps to improve the provision of services and how that helps to pave way for economic development. He will be summarizing empirical studies that he has been doing along with his colleagues and students. So we have here quite a large student population, which is a very good thing, which is a very rare thing. And I'm also happy to see that a number of students from my class are here. And a lot of our doctoral students are here, and some of our faculty are here too. So we have got some people.
Good.
So, would you like to take me?
Thank you very much. I have known Andy now for the last 8 years or so, and we've been working on AA for the last 6 years. And he is here with a promise that that paper will be completed. Andy and Mark, there are some collaborations in academia which are quite famous. We have the Sen and Paves, Eastman and Kotwal, Bhagwati and Srinivasan, and you have Andy Foster and Mark Rosenberg. There is a significant difference amongst these, and that has to do with the approach that Andy and Mark take to a large number of problems. Namely, that any storytelling that we do in terms of policy implications or talking about policy or deriving policy conclusions is always conditioned on a structure. So data talks conditioned on structure. So he is one of the finest microeconomists that I've seen, and it's been a privilege to work with him. There are a few papers of his which are, to my mind, fairly ought to be called seminal. The early one on democratization that he wrote with Mark Rosenberg, which perhaps for the first time talked about the need to democratize in villages and going after outcomes. It's a very thought-provoking and a very important paper in this area. And he has a model, he and Mark have a model which got published in Review of Economic Studies, which talks about household splits. How households split, how do they divide, and how do they go their separate ways, and predicting household splits. It's a fascinating model, and it's a fascinating paper, one of the widely cited papers. There is also a very interesting paper on forestry, which got published in Quarterly Journal of Economics, which takes the debate about economic development and forest development, and in India. And Mark and Andy have done significant work using Indian data. The data that was collected at various points in time at LCA are known broadly as the REGS data, Rural Economic and Demographic Survey. So the micro foundations of economic development are explained in his research like nowhere else to my mind. So it's a great pleasure to have him here. He kind of changed his travel plans, and I think he's flying in Johannesburg. So I don't know what level of jet lag he has, but relatively less because he was flying in from Boston. So welcome, Andy. This is my new home here. So you'll see me in the NCAR stomping the corridors. I still stomp corridors, but this is the new home. So welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. And thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks very much for having me here. It's a very pleasure to be here, and I wouldn't be here without Hari for two reasons. One, because he invited me, and second, because much of what I'm going to talk about is based on data that Hari collected or organized and left a lot of himself out on the road to put together, and including some work that he's done in various ways, because that sort of fit into the overall discussion. So rather than giving you one single paper, I'm going to try to give a perspective that I think will give you a sense of how I think about the world, and perhaps give you a sense of how modeling and empirical data can be used to sort of at least help think about what's obviously a really critical question, which is how does democratization work in general, and particularly how does it contribute to development at the local level. Okay? So that's what I want to sort of take on here. Okay. Okay. So let me first start with the sort of way that I've been thinking about the world as of late. As partly at Brown University, we're going through the process of building a campaign with our new president, who is in fact a development economist herself, Chris Paxson, and a co-author of mine as well. We've been putting together an initiative, and one of the areas that really seems active and of interest is this issue of service delivery in developing countries. It's a critical issue, and the framework that I want to start with, just because I think it's helpful to sort of see where we fit in here, is that sustained service delivery, and in some ways sustained development, to the extent that it's contingent on service delivery, depends on a combination of three things. Okay, and these are often studied in isolation, but I think they interact really importantly. Okay, the first is a demand on the part of constituents for a particular service, that people have to know and want what is being delivered to them. Okay, and so that's kind of the first thing, and that's not a given. There are plenty of examples of technologies that sort of various trials have shown have a really big impact on health that people don't seem to be willing to adopt, even when they have some sense of the value of this technology. So the first is people have to want it. The second is there has to be the capacity to deliver that service, that the local government has to be able to actually put that service into place. That it has the technological know-how and the budget and so forth. And again, that's not a given, as you know. And finally, there has to be the influence of households over public decision-making. Okay, and this kind of completes the circle, because it's all well and good for sort of an outside agent to come in and provide the resources to make a particular service available. But in the end, that service is really only sustainable to the extent that at least in a democratic society, the people know that they want something and they exercise the vote in such a way that that thing is provided out of the sort of public coffers, right? That it's not an external agency, it's actually internal to the community. And it's really the third issue that's going to be the primary focus that we're going to talk about here, and try to understand, well, how do households have an influence over public decision making? But it's going to touch on the capacity and the demand as well. Okay? So I'm going to make, I think, a somewhat controversial point that sort of builds on these literatures, and you know, I don't want you necessarily to take this literally, but I do want to sort of set it out there as kind of a way of thinking about a problem, and I really hope that there'll be some pushback and questions, and certainly many of you know more about, you know, have experiences that would be relevant to these sorts of things. Okay. So the first point I want to make is that there's an issue of sort of democracy and commitment. Okay, the commitment of politicians, and this is sort of the idea of a commitment among politicians is somebody makes a promise, you vote for them, they are committed to following that. Okay, we all know that the world doesn't usually work that way. It's also thought of as a kind of technical point. Okay, in modeling a political economy. But I want you to sort of at least make the point in the context of this talk that commitment is more than just a technical point. It actually has real implications for how village governance works. Okay? And so then the second point is that with democracy and a lack of commitment, okay, there's a sense in which households may choose a leader who's closer to their own views, okay, even if that person is less able to deliver the kinds of services than somebody else. Okay? You don't necessarily want the most competent politician, you want the one who sees the world the way you do to be your leader. Okay? But there's a trade-off there, and that's something I want to articulate. Okay? And so what the two things together suggest is that there is a certain sense in which this delivery of services may work better if there's a way for politicians to be committed. Okay, and the question is, how do you make sort of politicians committed? In other words, following through on the promises that they make. So there's a kind of transparency. And what I'm going to say is that all of these things, issues of incumbency, okay, the fact that incumbents get reelected, identity-based voting, okay, direct democracy, bribery, and in a sense training, which we'll talk about at the end, all of these things are potential ways of solving a commitment problem. Okay, and so some of these things obviously we don't think about as good, bribery for sure, caste voting, and so forth. But it's also possible to understand why they might arise and why they might have a particular role. Okay, and so I want to get into that as well. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm first going to sort of make a series of points using some graphs. Okay, and then I'm going to just show you a little bit of some of the technical background. But basically the story that I'm going to tell you is going to sort of be evident in the graph. So I want to go through slowly. And please stop me if something's not making sense. Okay. So here is it's a sort of simple graph, and what I've got is, think about this as income. It really could be anything. It's any way of stratifying the society, okay? And, but income is nice because you have a concentration of relatively poor people and relatively few people are relatively wealthy. That's certainly a characteristic of many villages. This is the density, okay? It says there's lots of poor people, not so many rich people. This is the cumulative density, so going from 0 to 1, and it has this kind of shape like this, okay? The other curve here is this red curve, okay, which goes from 1 to 0, okay? And the idea is that people who are poor and rich have different preferences for how people are going to how they would like their politicians to allocate resources. And to keep things very simple, I'm going to sort of say they're just two goods, okay? And the poor would like to spend a lot of money on roads, and the rich would like to spend their money on other things, okay? Just for the sake of argument, and because it's what we're going to use down the road, you can think about irrigation that particularly helps landowners, but it doesn't really matter here. All we really need is we need to have a difference of opinion of how you'd like the government to take its budget and how that should be distributed between different types of public goods, okay? Now, what can you kind of do with this graph? Well, one thing to say is, okay, well, what's going to happen in this world? What's going to happen if we sort of, this is a model. What's going to happen if we let people vote on an outcome, okay? What level of road expenditures is going to be chosen, okay? Well, in order to do that, we have to say something about a model of political economy, how an equilibrium in votes works, okay? A very standard model that arises is called the median voter model, okay? And it basically says that, in a democracy, at least in a very simple democracy, the median voter's preferences are what gets implemented, because then there's as many people who want more as want less, and so that's basically where you end up. And then you can see why I drove the cumulative distribution, because then you can just pick out who the median voter is. That's this guy, okay? And then you can say, okay, well, this guy about an income of 10, or whatever that is, and whatever units you might imagine, gets to sort of choose, and so the level of road expenditures here is going to be 85%, okay? Or 90%, okay? So that's kind of how you read this graph, that if we had an election, we'd have a prediction that, in fact, you'd get something that's fairly skewed towards the poor, because the poor are relatively abundant in this particular economy. Of course, this is saying the poor are voting their true preferences. They're not being influenced by the rich. They have the opportunity to vote the way they want to, and so forth. It is a simple model. Like all models, it's wrong, okay? But it's designed to make a point, okay? Okay, so now the first point is to say, okay, well, how do we know that democracy works, okay? And when we first began to tackle this problem, we realized there was a little bit of a problem here, okay? Suppose we compare a non-democratic society to a democratic society, okay? How do we know what democracy is doing, okay? And it became clear that you can't, by looking at the distribution of public goods, you really can't say very much about democracy. You need to also know something about what the preferences are of the people who are voting. Without knowing what the preferences are, you can't make a statement like democracy causes goods to be chosen that the majority of people like. Okay? And so that sort of made us realize that in order to really look at whether democracy really influences the distribution of public goods and how they're chosen, we need to use something else. Okay? And what we're going to use in the first instance is the distribution, the level of inequality in a village. Okay? In particular, we're going to say if democracy works the way we think it does, okay, then there should be a different outcome in villages that are more unequal than villages that are less unequal. Okay? And to sort of illustrate that point, I have the same cumulative distribution that I had in the previous graph, but then this is a much more equal society where the cumulative distribution, you know, sort of the median person here is a lot richer, okay? And so it kind of slopes upward, okay? And then you can ask the question, okay, this is one village, this is another village. What's going to be the consequence of a transition to democracy, okay? Well, before we kind of get there, we need to say, well, what happens, okay, prior to democracy, okay? And so, you know, one simple model is that prior to the democracy, the elite make a decision, okay? After democracy, you play this median voter game, okay, a voting game, and the poor's voice is heard more loudly. That's not the only thing can happen. But if you take that kind of seriously, you know, what you'd say is prior to democracy, the rich and the poor village wouldn't be very different, okay? Because basically the preferences of the rich in both villages is not very different, at least the way I've set up the model, okay? After democracy, what happens? Well, it's still going to be the case that in this blue village, that the median voter is here, and therefore the road expenditure is going to be here, okay? However, in the red village, the median voter is here, and therefore the road expenditure is going to be here, okay? So if we see, as we transition a village from being sort of elite governed, okay, to being democratically governed, if the model is giving a correct prediction, we should basically moving this way in the red village and this way in the blue village, that is, there should be more increase in road expenditures or things the poor like, okay, following the introduction of democracy. So I'm not making a very deep point here. It's not very complicated yet, but just wait, okay? But it is important to sort of walk before you can run. Okay, so now what I want to do is go back to our village with a relatively unequal distribution of income, okay, and add a little something, okay? And that's something I'm going to call competence, okay? The ability to deliver what you want, okay? And to make things simple, because I only have sort of 2 dimensions to work with, I'm just going to make the assumption that competence is higher among the higher income, okay? That may be a controversial assumption, but in the end, higher income people, for a variety of reasons, I think it suggests in some of the data we looked at, do have, first, they're better educated, they have better ability to deal with the system, They may have sort of more of a personal network that allows them to make things happen. But I don't really want to get bogged down in that point or another, that point here. Again, I just want to illustrate a point of what happens in this world. Okay? Well, the problem here is that this is sort of the preferences of the politician who gets elected. Okay? You can sort of think about, you know, if I'm a 20 and I get elected, this is what I will choose to try and implement. Okay? But what I can actually implement depends on my ability or my competence. Okay? And so if it's really true that people down here are less competent, okay, then even though they have a high preference for roads, the actual roads that they're going to build is going to be down here. Okay? And it might increase for a while, and then by the time you get over here, this guy over here, if this guy's like the president or the dictator, okay, well, he's very competent. He can deliver what he wants to deliver, okay, but he doesn't really care to deliver very many roads. Okay, he wants to spend the money on other things. Okay, and so at least in principle, it doesn't have to go this way, but just for the sake of argument, say that it does. So the basic point is, if I elect you as a politician and you're left to your own devices, you're going to do what you want to do, and then your competence is going to sort of make it clear what gets delivered. Okay? And then this is sort of what gets delivered of the other good, call it irrigation assets, if you will. Okay? Again, sort of at this stage, you know, if this person's elected, well, he doesn't really care very much about election assets, about irrigation assets. He's not very competent either, so, you know, not much happens here. But as competence increases, also the preference for spending money on irrigation assets increase. You go up there. Okay? So now we can sort of ask the question, well, what will happen in this economy, okay, when we sort of, you know, when we run an election, okay? And now you can begin to see why things are a little complicated, because you can ask sort of, well, what is this median voter going to vote for? Okay? So what is this guy going to choose? Okay? Well, this guy sort of, you know, what he would like to do, okay, is he'd like to choose this guy as his leader, okay, and therefore get the level of roads that he likes, okay, the median voter here, okay. In other words, you want a politician who believes what the average person believes in some sense. But he realizes if he does that, he's not going to end up with very much of either good, okay. So the median voter might say, okay, well, maybe that's not the best choice. Maybe I should shade my vote, okay, and try to attract this person here, okay? In which case, I'll actually get more roads, which is sort of what I want anyway, okay? I'll also get more irrigation assets, which I don't really care for. But you might imagine that would be the winning politician, someone who doesn't necessarily share his views, but who is actually more able to deliver those views, okay? So that's a world in which there's no commitment, okay? In a world with no commitment, a politician will do whatever he wants or she wants once she gets elected in this model, okay? What would happen if there was commitment? If the politician could make promises, okay, and then he or she would implement those promises exactly as he says he would, okay, in the election. Who would be elected? And what would that person announce as their policies? Okay? Well, it's pretty clear that what the sort of median person would like is he would like the very highly competent person to be the politician in charge, okay? But he would like that politician to promise to do mostly the spending on roads, okay? So he would like to elect a politician who will promise to do something different from what that politician would do if left to his own devices, given that he was in charge. Okay? So that's kind of the commitment problem in a nutshell. Okay? If a politician can commit, the median voter can command this, you know, a high level of roads because he gets a perfectly competent person who is committed to do what he wants him to do. Okay? If there's no commitment, that is, you vote for somebody and they become the politician, they do whatever they want, okay, then he might end up somewhere here, and you get someone who sort of delivers a little bit of each good. Okay? So that's kind of the sort of, so the question then becomes, how can we move a society from one in which there's no commitment to one in which there's some commitment, with the argument that some commitment is actually good for the median voter. It implements something that's good, in this case, for relatively poor people who are in fact the majority of the population. Okay? So that's the basic, so any questions about that? So this is really sort of fundamental to what I'm going to do in the next few minutes. Okay, feel free to ask questions. Any questions? Yeah?
Have you factored in the irrigation assets in the
Okay, so the idea is that this line here is how much, what share of the budget, of the public budget you want to spend on roads, and then irrigation assets is sort of the one minus that. Okay, so if you want to spend 80% of the money on roads, you want to spend 20% on irrigation. Okay, and so that line would just go like this. Okay, basically go up like that. But then because of the competence, what actually happens gets shaded downward. Okay, but thanks for asking. That's the kind of thing that needs to be clarified.
Please explain again. You said that if the commitment would be followed, but the commitment is there in the society. 100% commitment. In that case, we choose the most competent person.
Yes.
How start?
How what?
Please get this again from your graph.
Oh, okay. Well, so the idea would be, you know, the median voter should have the power, okay, and he wants this, okay, and so, you know, if the idea is if a politician wants to be elected, that's kind of a key assumption here, then this guy will promise to do this, okay? If he promises to do something different from that, then the guy who's a little bit less competent could actually beat him out in an election, okay? And so the only equilibrium, if there's commitment, is for the most competent guy to offer to do what the median voter wants, okay? That's otherwise, you know, the next guy can kind of outcompete him. Okay, now that does assume that the politician, you know, he gets sufficient rent or sort of value from being in office, okay, that he actually wants to be in office even though he doesn't get to make the decision that he would want. Right, that's kind of key here. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to sort of take you back a little bit in history to sort of say, okay, in order to ask whether democracy does what these models suggest it does, okay, we need a world in which we see a transition from, you know, no democracy to democracy. And in 1999, the Harris Red Survey that Harry mentioned, okay, collected a lot of information on elections, okay, the extent to which local panchayats were actually democratically elected. Now, you might have thought, given the amendments, that it should have been 100%, but it wasn't then. It took some time, okay? And the point is that if you go across states, according to our sample of villages, and this is a representative sample of rural India, but the number of villages in any given state is small. So it doesn't necessarily say that, for example, in Assam it was really 10% on average, but that's what our 3 villages in Assam look like, for example. And you see there's a lot of variation across states in the extent of democracy in 1999. Okay? And so we want to use this to look across basically 250 villages and see as they transition from being having a sort of traditional panchayat to an elected panchayat, okay, what happened to the kinds of public goods they purchased, okay, and how was that related to the level of inequality in their respective villages. Okay? Now, I'm not going to take you through all this pain, but I did do all the work, and so I want you to understand that this is behind the thinking, okay? A lot of math, okay, that helps at least me and you know, anybody I think who's trained in sort of political economy to think through the issue, but it's pretty much hard to make sense of outside of it. 2 things that are kind of showing up in this graph. The first is, okay, I was just telling you a story about a median voter, okay, and that works really well with a continuous distribution of income. However, for modeling purposes, okay, it's much easier just to think about landed households and landless households, Okay? Well, when you have landed households, when you have two categories, the median voter will then automatically be either landed or landless, and that's kind of a mess for modeling. Okay? It turns out with some very simple structure, you can get something called a mean voter model. Okay? Which is basically the preferences of a mean person is what's going to get implemented in the election under the commitment. Okay? And so the basic model is really just captured down here. Okay? So this is sort of the utility of the landed person, how well off the landed person is, given the public goods that are chosen. Okay, this is like irrigation, irrigation, roads, and schools. Okay, this is the utility of the average landless person as a function of those same public goods. They have to consume the same public goods because they're in the same village. Okay, rho is the fraction of households that are landless. Okay. And D is an indicator for democracy. Okay? If D is equal to 0 in this simple model, then the only group that whose preferences matter are the landed households. If D is equal to 1, that is sort of an even democracy. Okay? Then basically the weighting of the poor and the rich depends on their weighting in the population. Okay? And so what we're interested in asking is, as D changes, okay, what happens to T, R, and S? That is, as you transition to democracy, what would happen to irrigation, roads, and schools? Okay, but more importantly, how will that vary across villages that have a big rho, that is a high share of landless, and villages that have a low share of landless? Okay. In order to make this all work, we have to work this through a model. Okay, and again, I don't want to take you through all the details. But I want to sort of make one really key point here. Okay, we've written down a production function. The landed households are growing some crop, and they're using labor, and the landless households are working as laborers in part on the landed households. And so you can kind of think about what is the consumption of the landed households and the landless households. And the idea of the landless households, their only asset is L. Okay. And they're paid a wage W, okay? And so their consumption is just equal to the wage times the labor, okay? The landed households, okay, are going to make a decision about how many workers to hire, okay? So their consumption is going to depend on their profits minus what they have to pay to hire workers. Why do I want to emphasize this here, okay? Because the key issue here is there's a real difference of opinion between the landed and landless about any public goods that affect the wage. Because an increase in the wage obviously will benefit the landless, but it'll hurt the landed. Okay? So there's going to be a reason that the landed and landless won't necessarily agree on public goods that have an impact on the local wage. Okay? And then this is the kind of thing that we're sort of interested in. Again, I won't take you through all the math here. But basically, the idea is we're interested in how the landless share affects roads. And this is a mathematical expression that describes that. Okay? And the key is this mathematical expression is going to be less than 0 if D equals 0. And it's going to be greater than 0 if D equals 1. In other words, an increase in the fraction poor in this model is going to lead to more roads if democracy in place, but fewer roads if democracy is not in place. Okay? So again, if you kind of think about it for a minute, that's kind of what you might expect to see. Okay? So that was the sort of question that we were asking. Okay? And then we actually took it to the data. Okay? And I just want to give you a sense of the structure of the data. And then rather than kind of going through this table, I'm going to show you a graph. Okay? So these are going to be regressions that look at the same village over time. Okay? So it's using panel data. And the outcomes are roads, a good road, irrigation facilities, and a school. Okay? The right-hand side variables, the key one are whether there's an elected punch-out as opposed to a traditional one. Okay? And then this interaction of the elected punch-out and the landless proportion. Okay? And so what we're kind of interested in is we're interested in this set of coefficients. Okay? Which basically say, does the transition to democracy, does it have a different effect if there's a high share of landed and a low share of land versus a low share of landless? Okay? This is another thing we put in. I'll come back to that in a minute, which is sort of the effect of revenue authority, whether the village had the ability to levy its own taxes. Okay, that's sort of changed over time, and how that affected roads and irrigation. But let me skip that for the moment. Okay, what do we see? Okay, well, you see something that fits the model. Okay, which is to say that the predicted effect of elections on specific public goods by landless fraction. Okay, so here's the landless fraction in our villages. Okay, and what you see is the landless fraction gets higher. Okay, that when you transition to democracy, you tend to have a positive effect on roads. Okay, as you transition to democracy, it's basically a zero effect for roads when there's a very small fraction of landless. Okay, and the way you want to think about these coefficients is we're sort of fixing the number of people and the land in the village, and we're just changing the share of landless so that the sort of total amount of land in the village conceptually stays the same. Okay, so as you see, sort of, you know, that where the roads are built when there's a high fraction of poor and you transition to democracy. On the other hand, the transition to democracy tends to lead to reductions in irrigation assets being built. Okay, if you have a high fraction of poor, and an increase if you have a small fraction of poor. Okay, so and then schools don't seem to really be very different. Okay, so that's the so that's kind of the result of this sort of thing. Okay, so that was sort of based on a premise, and sort of the key aspect of the model, as I mentioned, was that wages, that the sort of how you feel about a public good, if you're landed or landless, depends on how that public good affects your wages. So if you're following me so far, you might have an idea about what we should expect to see between the relationship between roads on the one hand and wages on the other. Okay? In order to kind of make this sort of thing hold together, it must be the case that the poor like roads. Why do the poor like roads? Okay? Well, one possibility is that when the roads are built, wages rise. Okay? And there are actually two reasons for that. The first is it makes it easier for people to move off farm, okay, to say commute to a neighboring village or a factory or another place where agriculture is more productive. Okay? And also because building roads is actually quite labor intensive. Okay? And the basic point is, if you look at these regressions, you do indeed see that building roads does increase the wage. Okay? Basically, one good road coming to the village actually increases the wage based on this point estimate by about 70%. Okay? So so given this result, it seems no surprise that the poor have a particular interest in building roads because roads raise wages. Okay? And remember, and this is all based on the same village over time. So we're actually asking what happens if you have a village which didn't have a road and then it gets a road. What happens to the wage as compared to a village that didn't have a road and still didn't have a road at the later period? Okay? We see that irrigation facilities don't do much for the wage. Okay? So in fact, you know, this irrigation facilities may not be that bad for the poor. Okay? It doesn't push the wage down. Okay? But the point is that roads are much better. So if you have a fixed budget, if you're poor, you're more interested in exercising your vote towards the direction of roads. Okay?
Excuse me for a second.
Yes, sure.
Can I just, when you are considering the landless people, you are saying,
Yeah.
What is the use of irrigation for them?
Oh, okay. Well, remember, they work as laborers in part on farms. Okay? So if farms are more productive, the marginal product of labor should be higher. Okay? So typically, you know, the high-yielding variety crops that were sort of over this period really important in terms of expanding productivity were not labor-saving. Okay? If anything, they were labor-using, although our results suggest they were fairly labor-neutral. So when you went from a traditional crop to a high-yielding crop, your crop became more productive. Okay? But you didn't cut back on your labor. Okay? You sometimes increased it, in which case the sort of marginal product, labor now has a higher product, and if labor has a higher product, landed people are going to want to hire more workers. If they want to hire more workers, the wage will go up.
do the poor think the temporal effect, take into consideration while voting the temporal effect?
Temporal effect in terms of?
Like if you construct a road, then immediately they will get the return. And if you don't construct a road, the irrigation facility if you are going for, then that has got some temporal effect. In a latter period, they may benefit from that thing.
So you're right. So you know, we're in part limited by the data. We're really looking at current wages and roads and irrigation here. Okay. Obviously, that's not going to capture the potential downstream benefits. Of course, both irrigation and roads lead to downstream benefits, right? And so it's not absolutely clear sort of which would be bigger or which would be smaller. But the data doesn't really allow us, and it's just difficult to, it's more difficult to think about how you work with data when you're sort of asking what people think about the future unless you actually ask them about their expectations in the future, and we didn't do that in that survey. So that's a good, so yeah, these sort of, the different temporal impact is quite important, okay? One other point, these results are not too strong, but let me just tell you sort of why we did them and the direction in which they point, okay? One of the things that struck us about irrigation assets is that our data set was looking at public irrigation assets, but there are also private irrigation assets, okay? And that suggested something to us, which is that it was certainly possible that the public assets might substitute for private assets. And that might explain why in the previous graph, the public irrigation assets had no impact on the wage, despite what I just told you. Okay? And basically, that's what these positive coefficients, although they're not significant at conventional levels, it puts you in that direction. What we're actually seeing here, okay, is that when there's a high share of landless people, okay, and you move to democracy, in which case our results suggest that you don't get public irrigation assets, that private irrigation assets go up. Okay? So now you might see why the landed households have a particular benefit from irrigation assets, because it allows them to take advantage of public funds to produce something that they don't have to purchase themselves. Okay? So that's the kind of idea there. Okay. So that's the basic sort of story here, and this is a story that really doesn't pay specific attention to commitment, okay? But it really goes after that basic point that if you have a high share of poor, democracy is going to move you in the direction of things that the poor purchase, okay? And our results suggest that the transition from traditional to democratically elected punch-outs did have that impact in the 80s and 90s, okay? Which is what people wanted, but some people, a lot of people, I think, doubted that would have that impact. These results suggest they in fact did, okay? But now let's think a little bit more about the commitment problem, okay? So the commitment problem we sort of went through, okay? And one of the points that I made was that a commitment problem can in part be solved by caste, okay? And the idea is this, okay? Within the caste, there may be a group of people, there may be some difference of opinion about how public resources should be spent, okay? And there also may be differences of capability, okay? Of competence within that caste. But the idea is the caste has a way of controlling a politician from that caste after that politician is elected. That is because the caste creates a network and that people rely on, trust, and want to be thought well of, okay? A politician who's elected from the caste may be subject to less of a problem of commitment, okay, than one who is elected sort of more broadly. Okay, so this is really about identity-based voting. What are the advantages, potentially, of identity-based voting? Okay, and the idea is this idea of a caste being useful, okay, in terms of commitment, only works when the caste can actually elect one of their candidates. Okay, so the story you want to have in mind is, you know, the members of the caste get together and say, okay, you know, this particular person is a relatively well-off member of our caste. Maybe he wants irrigation assets rather than roads. Okay? However, we're going to say, we will elect you, even though you have different preferences than we do, as the caste as a whole, as long as you promise to do what we want rather than what you want. Okay? That way they can get the most competent person in the caste to take on the job. Okay? But not worry that that person will go off and do something that they don't want. So they use this sort of extra political sanctions to kind of hold on to that caste. Okay? And so this paper by my colleague Munshi and my co-author Rosenzweig, using again the NCAR Reds data, looks at that question. Okay? It also looks at sort of different types of elections, ones that were restricted in various ways. Okay? But the key point that I want to make about this is that there's a lot of variation across these villages, okay, in the sort of distribution of shares within a ward, okay, of one caste. So if you sort of are following me so far, commitment is a really good thing, okay, but you can only implement if your caste is a big enough share of the ward so that you can actually exercise some muscle in the election and pick the person that you want. Okay? And what you see is that, at least in open elections, okay, you have a fairly high fraction of cases with close to a majority of people in the ward. So this is by ward, so it sort of requires that people within the ward are all sort of living and working together. Okay? And so the basic point is that you're going to see some variation across villages that's going to be related to what fraction of the people in that village are from the same caste. And this yields something which is kind of curious. Okay? So this is from a simulation model, but it corresponds to the graphs that I already showed you in a way. Okay? It basically tells you that, according to the model, okay, that if you get a large enough fraction of people in a caste, there's a big jump in the public goods that come to your neighborhood. Okay? That's the kind of idea here. Okay? And the point is that, once a caste has a 50 to 60% majority within a particular ward, that caste can pretty much dictate, we're going to elect somebody, and we're going to pick the most competent person from our caste, and we're going to ask that person to implement what we want them to do. It's the kind of story. Okay? And the model predicts this sort of big jump, because if you're less than 50%, you may have decided who the best person is for your caste, but some other caste will beat you out. Okay? But once you have a majority, you can solve the commitment problem, and therefore you're going to get a more competent politician on average than you would if you have a bunch of small castes, none of which can solve this commitment problem. Okay? So that's the theory. Okay? This is the data. Okay? So this is basically looking at things that Rosenzweig and Munshi show increased competence overall if you have a more educated, richer, and someone who's been a manager in their job. The more you have those sorts of things, the more public goods like street lights and other things come to your ward. Okay? And what they show is that just as in the theory, when you get to about 50%, okay, there's a big jump in competence, okay, as measured by these things. Okay? So once you have a big enough caste, just as the theory predicted, you get a more competent person, okay, who then presumably is able to deliver on the kinds of things that you would want as a caste. The majority caste gets to choose what they want particularly. Okay? So any questions about that? Okay, so this is a kind of test of this idea of commitment. It says, how can a commitment be solved? Well, it can in part be solved by caste. Okay? So from this perspective, identity-based voting is not altogether a bad thing. Yes?
So, right, so you say as a share of the caste increases,
Yeah.
in terms of the overall population or whatever, the public, the benefit they get also increases in terms of commitment and capability, right?
Yeah.
In terms of commitment goes up if the share of the caste increases.
Yes.
So,
And it jumps, right, at about 50%.
but that's not something you can control, right? The share of the caste.
That is correct. Well, you could by reorganizing the village, of course, and by defining wards, right? You could gerrymander, which is what we do in the U.S. all the time, to control that, right? I'm not recommending that you introduce gerrymandering in punch-out elections, but
Usually, if you're talking about social, caste,
yeah.
it's not something that can change over a period
No,
of
you
time.
can't change caste,
Yeah.
but you could change the definition of what a ward is. Okay? Imagine that you drew the boundaries of the ward in such a way, okay, that all the Brahmins were in one ward. Okay? Then the Brahmins could solve the commitment problems within their particular ward.
Because it's a related proportion, you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah, so that's the idea. So gerrymandering, I don't know if that word's familiar to you. It's a sort of,
It's done in India, it's called delimitation.
what's it called?
Delimitation.
Okay, all right. So yeah, so anyway.
Yeah, once in a while. But it was done recently.
Okay, so the point is that this thing which we normally think of as a bad thing could have some beneficial effects from the perspective of being able to pull out a politician who's relatively competent, okay, and still get that politician to implement things that are more in line with the average views of the caste. Okay? Yeah.
It's two small things. One thing is that delimitation is actually not done with the purpose of doing delimitation for identity,
Yeah.
identifying people of similar groups together.
Yes.
The second thing is that there is something called faction.
Yes.
There's something called faction. Faction is in a particular area, in a ward, there could be three factions working within the same class. And the
Yes.
accountability of the faction leader is not to the entire caste.
Yes.
It might not be even to the caste members either. It
Yes.
could only be to the core members of the faction.
Yes.
So actually, there would not be, you cannot assure commitment to the entire caste group by choosing a leader from the same caste.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right that what what they would have liked to do is to have collected data on factions so they could actually, because what you're saying is that exactly right. If the caste is split up into factions, then the theory should be about factions, not about castes. Okay? Unfortunately, measuring factions is much more difficult than measuring castes. So from an empirical perspective, what we had in the data was castes, with some hope that castes capture enough of the variation in sort of political constituencies that you still can see these kinds of patterns, and indeed you can. So caste must be powerful enough here. What you're saying is that if we could actually do this by factions, it should be even more powerful.
So I would like to question this very thing that if that is the thing that caste-based politics
Yeah.
is going to support development, then in the past few years it has been the case in our state of UP, Bihar, and the development has been very low out there.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that the caste-based politics is very high there. And they are selecting the people who are more representative as per the theory of caste, but that is not turning out to be in development.
Well, so I think it's very difficult to do this at the ecological level. Okay, I'm going to show you some results from Hari, so I'm going to ask Hari to defend this.
Possibly one reason could be behind it, because we have taken an assumption that the higher income groups are more competent.
Yes.
As the income level increases, the competency increases. Now, this assumption itself will not hold around at various places.
It doesn't necessarily hold, but the way this is done, okay, well, I haven't gone into all the machinery because there's not really time. This wouldn't be seen if it weren't the case that these three groups were more capable of delivering these public goods. So it turns out to be true that when you have someone who's more educated, richer, and managers, all else being equal, you're more likely to get streetlights on your street. Okay? So it is an assumption, but it's actually partly testable using these methods. And they do find some evidence that, in fact, all else being equal, you're better with an educated person as your ward leader. You get more stuff. Yeah?
we got around the factions story by talking about coalitions.
Yeah.
In the paper that we do,
Right.
Hans and I do, we get around by talking about the advantages of forming coalitions.
Yeah.
So certain types of jatis, certain types of castes form coalitions to get over their lack of size within the village, so that the leader of the right kind of their preference is likely elected. So one can
Yeah, so
still
the coalition has to be able to form some kind of a binding agreement for that to work, right?
Exactly.
Or partially binding, right?
Yes.
And there's reasons that might happen,
Yes.
but that's exactly. Okay, so now this is work by a student that looks at another issue, which is incumbency, okay? And I don't want to spend a lot of time here. We're already, I guess, about an hour. But let me just sort of tell you this, what was going on. So the idea of this student's work, okay, was to show how a president worked with self-help groups, okay, to their mutual benefit, okay? And in terms of, benefits, what we're talking about is that the self-help groups were getting more access to NREGA funds and more access to self-help credit, okay? When the president of, when the Punjab leader, okay, was up for re-election, okay? So this is just a brief result to say there's some evidence here, not surprising, that incumbency, okay, when there's an incumbent advantage, that also helps to solve the commitment problem, right? When, back in the US, when President Obama was in his first term, he had to be a little bit careful about doing things that were different from what he promised because he wanted to be reelected, okay? Now that he's in the middle of his second term, okay, he cannot be reelected. So, barring the fact that Congress won't let him do anything he wants, okay, he in principle could do anything he wants, okay? So incumbency is another way of solving the commitment problem, okay? But incumbency, again, is something that we worry about a little bit. In fact, there's lots of cases where we introduce term limits, like the one I just mentioned, because we're worried about incumbency, okay? So I'm not sort of telling you that incumbency is always good. What I'm saying is there's a potential advantage of incumbency, okay? And this is not irrelevant in the context of the reservations in Indian villages, right? The process of reservations essentially eliminates incumbency. Or at least over a short term, because you're always kicking politicians out of office for whoever's in the reservation next. Okay? So without saying that's a bad thing, and I certainly think there are many advantages, it does create at least the possibility of losing some of the commitment problem and therefore potentially reducing the competence. Okay? Not because we believe there's a difference in competence of different groups necessarily, but because politicians no longer have as much reason to be committed to what they said they would do. Okay? So just wanted to look briefly at some results. These are hard, so I should really have him talking. Okay? But let me just sort of explain what I get out of them. Okay? Let's see. So this is looking at measures of change in identity-based voting, okay, over time, and changes in per capita consumption. Okay? And the basic sort of statistical correlations arising that when villages are moving towards more reported identity-based voting, we asked these people, why did you vote for whoever you voted for? And many of them said, because of their caste. Okay? And it turns out when that happened more often, okay, consumption for those people increased. Okay? Now, is that necessarily a result of the model? No, not necessarily. But it is consistent with this idea that identity-based voting might help improve public goods that are beneficial to that caste. Okay? And so this is another way of changing identity-based voting. This is another way of looking at that. Okay? Controlling for some other stuff. And again, it sort of gives you this basic point that, what I think when Hari did this regression, I don't know what he really believed, but I know that his co-author was troubled by this. Okay, because his co-author doesn't think identity-based voting is a good thing, and yet they did these regressions, and it looked like identity-based voting might be a good thing. Okay, now there might be a variety of reasons, but one reason is the problem of commitment. Okay, to get even more controversial, Okay? Now we can bring in bribes. Okay? How do bribes help solve the commitment problem? Okay? Well, basically because they're a way of paying somebody who's competent to do what you want them to. Okay? So the most competent person in the village might build roads and extract all the bribes from people who are the majority in the population. Okay? And that gets him to do something that he wouldn't do if left to his own devices. Okay? He's doing what people want. Now, I don't want to, take this too far, right? I'll be attacked, right? Because there are important distributional impacts, right? This guy is a politician. He's supposed to be doing things not by bribery, but because he was elected to do those things. Okay? The fact that he's extracting all this other rent from the majority of the population, instead of taking their votes, he's taking their cash, right? That has real distributional implications. So there are costs to bribery as well, for sure, right? And all this is not, I'm not making policy implications here. I'm just suggesting that one way of thinking about bribery is as a potential solution to the competency problem, okay? And so, the bottom line is, here's predicted consumption growth with and without bribes, okay? And again, these are mostly sort of descriptive things, okay? What you see at various stages, okay, particularly for sort of the relatively well-off households, that bribery is actually increasing consumption growth for those households, even if they're not politicians, okay? Situation perhaps less positive for the poor. They can't afford the bribes, right? So there is that sort of distribution implication. But there is at least a suggestion that bribery can be used to get a competent politician to come in and do what the population wants, okay, by giving him all these rents, giving us all this extra money that he wouldn't otherwise have, okay, or she. It's not limited to men. Okay. So let me then close up here and then take, if there are any more questions, okay. So, the bottom line here is, we've looked at a particular sort of issue, okay, which is sort of this ability to translate people's preferences into effective service delivery. And it's a critical part of the democratic process, in my view, critical to the development process. Unless you have that piece where people's preferences get implemented through democracy and they get kicked out of office, if they don't do it, if they don't help to provide development, is really critical in the long term. Okay? There's a lot of work sort of studying individual household demand and service delivery, and that's not going to be enough. You need the whole package of demand, influence, and capacity. Okay? And so local government has a key role to play in these issues. And so that's sort of a point about why it is that local democracy is really important. Every village in our model comes to a different view based on its particular composition, and it's not clear that the center can really help there. Okay. On the other hand, there may be issues where local government doesn't have the capacity to do what people want, and that's really a clear reason where the center needs to play a role. And it's also the case that that the center can potentially play a role in competence. So throughout this paper, or this series of papers so far, competence is taken as a given. Okay? But that's not really the case, right? It's potentially the case that you can increase people's competence by educating them. In fact, that's the business we're in, right? If we weren't increasing your competence, then you should stop giving us your tuition dollars, okay? And so, similarly, that's another sort of implication of this, that to some extent, the way to solve this problem is not necessarily to increase commitment, but to increase the skills of the people who are running for office, regardless of where they are in the income distribution and so forth. Okay, so I haven't sort of made that point. We don't really have good studies of that point, but I think it is an implication of thinking about the world in this way. Okay, so let me stop with that. I'm not sure exactly how much time you had allocated me, but it's 6:30 now, so it's up to you.
So made a point that saying that efficiency of the panchayats and the ability of choice of rules. The point is that most of the cases the panchayats don't have this legislative power of making the choice. It's more of a government schemes, particularly in the case of India,
Yes.
which are driving the basic services. So how come, given the fact that the major revenue for the panchayats are basically from the government schemes, which are basically most of it is tied, okay, tied to the schemes. So how come you say that there is a that the panchayats, the ability of the panchayat leaders actually to make the choices?
Well, yeah. So you know, it's certainly. I mean, the problem. Part of the problem is India is a big country, and how these things work out in any particular place may vary. Okay, and we all have our own knowledge and so forth. One of the advantages of a sort of national data set is you're picking up a national picture. However, it's and the data are clearly showing, okay, both in this study and some other ones, that who's in charge matters in terms of what gets distributed. Okay, those of us who've done this work, and it's not just me, it's a whole series of colleagues, you know, are sort of sometimes a bit puzzled. But I think that the resolution is that yes, everybody sort of gets the schemes. Okay, they get checks. They can advocate more or less for particular schemes coming to them. They can make sure that when the money comes to them, it gets actually used for the purpose for which it was intended. Okay, and so you know, even if I'm the politician and I get whatever 10,000 rupees for roads and 10,000 rupees for irrigation, if I care about roads, I actually make sure that 10,000 rupees worth of roads get built. I don't care so much about irrigation, I might just consume that, right? So you can sort of think about that. Now, as I said, we want to work in a stylized model. We don't want to have all those sort of things going around because the basic point, I think, goes through even in the presence of that sort of story. Okay? But the bottom line is the data does tell us that who's in charge does matter for what gets built and when. Okay? But it's a good question.
In addition to him, actually, because that was also my question, because the level of panchayat democracy is such that many of the key decisions are taken by the lowest level or the higher level.
Yeah.
And another factor is the root factor. There are many of the decisions at the panchayat level of how the voters will behave, maybe depends upon the macroeconomic picture of that place. Okay, or the political macroeconomic picture of that matters. Okay. A person may be got elected just because he is actually supporter or activist of a particular political outcome. And the larger population of that region is actually supporter of that because that political outfit has done some macroeconomic changes in that whole state or whatever. Okay. And this analysis and actually completely not really much encouraged or discussed.
Yes.
So that's in addition to this, in that the level of democracy we have, okay, and the decision making power and the panchayat and implementing power within the panchayat, that actually varies, and many times that may not be very relevant. Rather, what people perceive, that will be more matter than that what actually who has done. And second thing is the macroeconomic environment, which actually may have a much bigger role than the individual stock markets.
Can I add one more?
Yeah, sure. Of course.
Not a question, but just a small addition.
Yeah.
Is I think I understand there could be limitations of data with regard to what kind of factors, what kind of indicators you had to really refer back to. The thing is that the caste functions at different levels differently.
Yes.
At a village level, it functions very differently. There are many other issues actually are important more than caste. There are tendencies of what Professor Nagarajan said, possibly he was talking about that. This collision of caste. Collision of caste happens less so at village level. When you talk about collision of caste, it actually means polarization of caste is happening. Castes are congregating in terms of voting and voting together, more like a herd. That happens more at a regional level or sub-regional level. That happens in MLA election. That happens in MP's election more than actually in elections at a Gram Panchayat level. Because at Gram Panchayat level, there are issues of day-to-day life that are more critical. and factions are there to emerge much more. There's a greater probability of factions to emerge at a Gram Panchayat level than actually at any other level. They might not stay for long. They might change, there could be variability in their structure. But in one village, one Gram Panchayat, even if there is a 60% population of one particular caste, there will be 3 factions headed by leaders from the same caste. So there would be actually coalitions of factions happening than actually coalitions of caste. So in terms of actually ensuring commitment from caste by electing somebody from caste is sociologically little difficult to come to terms with. That's my,
Yeah.
but I understand limitations of data.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think the thing the point that I want to make is that these are all regressions, and our squares are far from 1, right? They're very, very far from 1, okay? We're trying to ask, in these papers, it's sort of trying to ask, if you think about the problem in this way, does that effect exist? And it doesn't say that all these other effects are not there and very important. And frankly, to some of them actually could be studied with this data set. Okay? So it's, absolutely the sort of local knowledge is really good for thinking about, okay, what might be the other things that are important that, in addition to this, help for us to understand what actually happens. Okay? And so I absolutely, and that's one of the reasons I come and talk about these things, is to hear, what else is in my error term, right? And I think a lot of what you're saying is, yes, there's a whole lot in there, right? Absolutely. Yeah.
In this model, are we giving more importance to competence or to commitment? Because what is happening is, competence is something which you can build upon, but commitment has to come from within, and what the experience we have seen, caste is mostly being used for divisive politics rather than for development.
Okay. No, I mean, the simple point is that in the context of this way of thinking, in terms of these models, okay, competence only creates problems because of a lack of commitment. Okay? So they're, tied together in this model. If you only had a commitment problem, no variation in competence, none of this would happen. Flip side, the other way around, right? But I think what you're sort of getting at is commitment itself is a form of competence, right? And that there might be, some people are intrinsically, going to, if they say something, they keep their word, right? And that would be an important feature of a politician, right? You would want to elect probably such a politician if you had access to that. And yeah, here we're taking sort of commitment as at least roughly correlated with these observable measures, but again, there's lots of other things in commitment, personal attributes of a politician that matter in particular elections, but hopefully in the context of a study of 250 villages, more or less average out. We can argue whether that's true or not, but it's possible. But it's a good question, right? How do you identify competence? Can we show that people who can exhibit commitment in some way are going to be more likely to be elected politician? I think that's probably the case, but I don't quite know how to do that because I don't know how to measure with a data set, who has commitment and who doesn't. I can only do it using these imperfect aspects of who they are. But it's a good thing to pursue for sure. Yeah.
Local judgments and variations in them. Now, is it generalizable that the preference for roads will increase with increase in income and so will decrease with the preference for irrigation will decrease with increase in income? Is that generalizable and is any causality established?
Well, okay. So, almost everything we've done is by looking at the same village over time. Okay. So there's a lot of village-to-village variation in income that we're essentially discarding, okay? Because we're really interested in the thought experiment of those particular attributes. If democracy gets introduced, what happens, okay? Because we're sort of putting in what we econometrics of village fixed effects, sort of controlling for everything about the village that's fixed over time. It may well be the case that what we find in terms of what the poor and rich want within a village that changes over time might not correspond to what happens if you look across villages at any particular point in time. So it may well be the case that rich villages, on average, have more roads, okay? Our analysis doesn't say anything about that because we're really saying for the same village, fixing, you know, everything that's fixed, their land, you know, the type of land they have, in terms of the crops they grow, and the composition of castes, of you know, land and landless shares. We're taking those all as given, right? And we're looking at what happens if you introduce democracy in these societies. So I think that is a really important issue, that it doesn't necessarily say what we see in a cross-section. It could be something totally different than what you see for the same village over time. Often it's backwards.
I'm asking for particular village only. So it always holds that with increase in income, there will be decreased preference for roads.
So I guess what I'm saying is that we don't really do that comparison in this analysis because that's going to be in the fixed effect. We're not really saying that as the share of landless increases, do you have more roads or more irrigation? We don't ever estimate that model because what we do is we sort of take that as a fixed thing, the share of landless. I mean, we've obviously done that regression. I can't remember what it was, but the analysis is really not designed to get at that question. What is the effect of landlessness on roads? It's given your landless share, what's the effect of democracy on roads? Okay, so it's a different way of thinking about it. Not that that question isn't interesting and important, but it's not the one that these papers as a whole are pursuing. Okay.
You mentioned something about fiscal decentralization in the initial part.
Oh gosh, I never got back to that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So can you just, how would the model change, or what would the implications be if the panchayat bodies are able to raise revenues for?
Okay. Yes. No. I should have come back to that. I did. Let me just tell you. So you know, this is pretty tentative. We had a variable in the data. We wanted to see what it did, and we think we understand it. Okay. First, let me just tell you what this says. Okay. What this says is that, and sort of forget about this. This is kind of a mixed bag. But this is the interaction with the local landless population and the revenue authority. And it turns out if you have more poor people, okay, then a transition to having revenue authority increases public goods. Okay? So it's a little tricky to kind of go through why that might be the case. Okay, it's what we see in the data first. But the way we understand this is this can be a test of the overall regressivity and progressivity of the way taxes are introduced when you have revenue authority. Okay? And the basic idea is really that if, in the context of the model we're looking at, if tax rates are perfectly equitable, that is to say the same tax rate on wages as on rents, then changing the fraction of people who are poor, if the amount of land and the number of people stays the same, should have no impact on revenue. Okay? It shouldn't do anything. Because you'd just be redistributing money to different, you know. What's that?
How are you defining revenue?
We're thinking about it as a proportional increase in tax, just a small tax on wages and rents, and the question we want to ask is that tax that they introduce when they have revenue authority the same for rents and for wages? Okay? If it's not the same, let me just complete this.
If you look at agriculture and the Indian
Yes.
villages, tax is zero.
Well,
Tax is zero.
No, but villages have increasingly, in some areas, been given the ability to raise revenue. All right, you want to jump in?
The Constitution prescribes 27 items on which taxes can be levied. And our data actually shows that there are villages in this sample where taxes are being levied. And this comes back to the usual discussion about panchayats on 3 Fs. The finances functions and whatever functionaries. When people talk about panchayats, that's what they talk about. And when the tax authority is basically built into the amendment. It is not the law, but it is still built into the amendment. The power to tax is actually given to the panchayat, and 27 items are identified.
So this is not wage. It is not taxes on wage.
Well, of course not.
And the second thing is that whatever the power given to the panchayat, most of them on the assets, on the non-taxable.
Yes.
And the tax part actually primarily collected by the state government on behalf of the panchayat.
Yeah.
Given that to the
Well, yeah, but it's
so that's the
yeah, but this is about revenue and raising authority at the panchayat level. Okay, we know a lot about taxes at sort of a broader level. We know very little about the incidence of taxes at the panchayat level. There are 27 items. Exactly whether that's regressive or progressive depends on, who owns which items, which is a point you raised. It also depends on any indirect effects, right? If I tax something that uses a lot of workers, then that's going to in effect be a tax on workers, even though it was actually a tax on capital, right? So my point is, we didn't really know anything about whether taxes operate in a way that's roughly proportional. Okay. However, if it was roughly proportional, that is to say the incidence of taxes, once you count for all the indirect effects, was roughly the same for the landed and landless, this should be 0. It's not actually, it's positive. Okay? And I say it's kind of a weak result, but the fact that it's positive is actually consistent with on net the taxes being regressive. Okay? Now, given, I absolutely agree, most of the taxes are on assets, that's a funny thing to say. It doesn't seem quite right.
Those are non-tax revenue, and most of the taxes at the local government levels are indirect taxes.
Yes.
These are direct taxes.
Yes. No, I understand. So I don't want to make sort of too much about it, but it is something we did, and it did sort of seem that revenue authority actually, when they're poor, it increases, but that's actually consistent. It may be consistent with a lot of things. It's consistent with a somewhat regressive tax system once you account for the indirect channels. So it's a weak enough result that I wouldn't want anybody to make any policy conclusion. On the other hand, there's almost nothing that has been done to look at the consequences of revenue authority, which is, I think, why you raised the question in the first place, or why, yeah. And this points in that direction. There's perhaps a way of approaching this problem. I think it's imperfect and so forth, but I think it's kind of intriguing that you might be able to think about things in this way. Yeah?
Is there any special reason why we have chosen these 3 parameters? And if we choose like more parameters to like broadly to make our study much more deeper, so will the result will it have any repercussion on the result?
So you mean the 3 different public goods? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, the 3 rent.
So 2 things. We wanted something that was in the data that was measured at 3 points in time. Okay? So we're kind of limited by what was available to us. There are some more things, but they're not always collected. This is a panel study, and as I said, we want to sort of do things for the same village over time. So we were kind of limited. And we also, sort of thinking about it, sort of thought that these 3 were, representative of the 3 different types. Something that favors the landed, something that favors the landless, and something that might be more neutral. But certainly, any public goods that you had, you could add into this analysis. And there's not a whole lot more you can do than these in this particular data set, but there are certainly other data sets that have a much richer set of public goods and would show that, in fact, the leadership of panchayats does have an impact on sort of how that works. The other thing is that the Munshi and Rosenzweig survey, which is deals with things like street lights and so forth, so they're less sort of, it's a different strategy. It doesn't look at this so much. It looks more directly at the caste issue. But you're basically thinking about, panchayat has a certain amount of money for street lights. Which ward does it put those in, right? This gets debated, and people come up with a conclusion. And you might imagine that if you have more competent people argue, you're more likely to win. But so yeah, there are a series of things that are used. But these 3 were chosen here mostly because we had them for multiple points in time. The problem is, when this data were first collected in '82. Okay, or actually they were first collected in 1967, nobody even thought that studying panchayats was an interesting thing to do. In fact, you couldn't have done then because elections were relatively uncommon, right? So one of the frustrations of a panel data set is that over time, questions become important, and then you wish that somebody had bothered to ask these questions sometime before, but they weren't thinking of those questions at the time. So that's in some sense why we're mostly limited to a relatively few variables, but you could look at a bunch of things. As long as you had a theory about, or evidence on which goods different groups cared about. That is, I don't particularly care if you say, oh, well, I really care about, you know, whether there's a mosque, okay, for this purpose, okay, in the village, or some kind of, you know, religious institution in the village that was built from village funds, okay? Because I don't know necessarily, at least off the bat, whether it's something that the poor want, or the rich want, or the third caste want, or another caste wants. If you can tell me, okay, you know, for example, a mosque, the Muslim people want the mosque, everybody else doesn't, okay? Then you could actually make some predictions of this sort for a mosque. That's just a specific example. But in order to do all of this, you need to know something about who values those public goods. Otherwise, it becomes perhaps an interesting policy exercise, but it's not very useful for testing theories about democracy. Okay?
So I have one question on your model.
Yes.
Following from one of the questions one of the things he was asking with regard to income. He was trying to suggest that over time, income has been improving in Indian villages. Even the distribution might be moving towards less, not necessary, but
yes.
Now when you use a fixed effects model, then does the, you know, the effect of not wanting roads might be the effect of increased incomes and not of your democracy.
I see.
So does that, he was not pushing it that far, but basically you're losing out on increasing incomes, which is a very great fact in India.
Yes, so you know, here's the story, that in addition to having village dummies, okay, village fixed effects, they're time fixed effects, okay? So any average income growth across villages is again going to be wiped out. We're not learning anything from that, okay? So, you know, that's just in the background, right? That's just captured by this other variable, and we're not sort of looking at it. You know, so yeah, that's a problem from the perspective of policymakers. We'd like to know is if India got richer, would they build more roads? From looking at the roads around, they did, right? They look awfully good, the highways, okay? But you know, I think this particular exercise is not really good at answering that particular question. But the data set could be used, you know, very well to see to what extent do you see, you know, in areas where there was more income growth, did you see more roads, more irrigation, and so forth. But that's a different question from the question about sort of controlling for average income growth. Is it the case that the share of landless affects how democracy gets played out? So it's a different question, I would say.
Does it sort of vitiate your point where you're saying that all this is because of increasing democracy? Might be because of increasing incomes.
Well, so it would have, you know, of course, any confounding thing like that, in order for it to sort of confuse the results, is it would have to be perfectly correlated with transitions to democracy. So we're using the fact that in our data set, some villages are transitioning and some are not. Okay. If it was true that the villages that were transitioning to democracy were exactly the ones that had the biggest increase in income, then you're right, we really couldn't tell the difference between an increase in income and how it affects the poor versus the rich, and the consumption of public goods, and democracy. Okay? We can actually look at that in part. We don't see that the change to democracy is correlated with pretty much anything, at least in terms of initial conditions. Okay? It's not that it's random, but within a state, you know, whether it happens in a particular village, one village and not another, seems almost as good as random. It's obviously not random, it represents something, but it's not correlated with a lot that's in the village. So in that sense, we think it's unlikely, but, you know, the nature of empirical work in economics is you never quite know that there isn't some other variable that's capturing the same variation. And the only thing that can help you is, at least we have a theory about what democracy should do. The data seem consistent with that. Maybe somebody else can come up with a theory about what income should do and say, okay, well, that's different, and then you might be able to test the difference. But the use of theory here is, I think, really important, and I hope that came through. All right, well, thank you very much. You've been a very engaging audience, and quite exhausted me. Is there another question or? Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you, and so thank you to the students for having come in and asked all these very interesting questions to make it much more interesting. And you enjoyed it as much.
Oh, very much. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank